She just exists here, my daughter-in-law whispered at the Thanksgiving table, loud enough for everyone to hear, but quiet enough to pretend she didn't mean for me to. My son kept cutting his turkey. My grandchildren stared down at their plates. And in that moment, sitting beneath the warm yellow lights I had hung with my late husband 15 years earlier, I realized something that hurt more than aging, more than grief, maybe even more than loneliness. I was no longer part of my own family. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end and tell me where you're watching from, because I never imagined my story would travel farther than the walls of that dining room. Thanksgiving had always belonged to me. For 37 years, I was the one who woke before sunrise to prepare everything. The turkey brining in the refrigerator, the pumpkin pies cooling beside the window, the smell of cinnamon and butter filling every corner of the house. Even after my husband George passed away 3 winters ago, I kept the tradition alive. I told myself traditions mattered. Family mattered. But that year felt different from the moment Nicole walked into the kitchen wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She barely looked at me when she handed over a store-bought cranberry pie and said, "We couldn't stay long this year." Ryan followed behind her carrying his phone instead of helping with the food. My son used to hug me the second he walked through the door. He used to ask if I needed help in the kitchen. Now he barely lifted his eyes from his screen. Dinner started late because Nicole insisted on taking pictures first. Pictures of the kids. Pictures of the table. Pictures of herself holding a wine glass beside the fireplace George built with his own hands. At one point she looked around the room and frowned slightly. "The lighting in here is so outdated," she said casually. I pretended not to hear her. I spent most of dinner refilling glasses, carrying dishes, and quietly clearing empty plates while conversations moved around me like I wasn't even sitting there. Then came the moment I can still hear perfectly in my head. Nicole leaned toward one of her friends and laughed softly before saying, "Honestly, she just exists here." The table went silent for half a second, just long enough for everyone to know I heard it. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but said nothing. Not one word. I remember looking down at the gravy spoon in my hand and noticing it was shaking slightly. Strange, the little things you remember when your heart breaks. I smiled anyway. I even asked if anyone wanted more stuffing. Because women my age learned very early that humiliation is easier to survive when you stay calm. But inside, something cold settled into my chest. That night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes while the house creaked quietly around me. George's old clock ticked above the stove. The leftover pie sat untouched on the counter. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, this house no longer felt like home. I barely slept that night. The house made too many sounds after midnight. The refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen. The old pipes clicking behind the walls. The wind brushing against the backyard fence George painted every spring until his arthritis became too painful. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Nicole's words over and over again. She just exists here. It was such a small sentence. Calm, casual, almost careless. But somehow that made it hurt worse. Cruelty spoken too comfortably usually means it has been thought for a very long time. Around 4 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and wrapped my cardigan tightly around my shoulders. The hardwood floor felt cold beneath my feet as I walked downstairs. The dining room still looked exactly the way I had left it after everyone went home. Wine glasses half empty. Crumbs scattered across the tablecloth. One of the grandchildren had forgotten a paper turkey centerpiece near the salt shaker. I started cleaning quietly, more out of habit than purpose. I had spent most of my adult life cleaning up after other people. Their messes, their moods, their carelessness. George used to tell me I made a house feel alive. "You make people feel safe here," he once whispered while helping me wash dishes after Christmas dinner nearly 20 years ago. I remember smiling at the sink while snow fell outside the kitchen window. Back then, Ryan would sit at the counter stealing pieces of pie when he thought I was not looking. The house used to feel warm in a way that had nothing to do with the furnace. Now it just felt crowded with ghosts. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat alone at the table while dawn slowly brightened the windows. That was when I noticed something strange. Every photo on the wall had changed over the past year, and somehow I had not realized it until then. The newer family pictures were centered around Nicole and the children. Ryan stood beside them smiling politely. But me? I had slowly disappeared. In one frame, I was cropped halfway out near the edge. In another, Nicole had replaced an old Thanksgiving portrait with one from their ski trip in Colorado, a trip I had found out about through Facebook pictures 3 days after they left. There was not a single recent photograph of George anywhere downstairs anymore. I stared at the empty spot above the fireplace where his favorite picture used to hang. A heavy silence settled over me then. Not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet understanding. This had not happened overnight. I had not suddenly become invisible during one Thanksgiving dinner. It had been happening slowly for years. One polite dismissal at a time. One forgotten invitation. One interrupted conversation. One, maybe another time, Mom, from Ryan whenever I asked to see the children. Nicole had not removed me from the family all at once. She had done it carefully, gently, almost professionally. And the worst part was realizing how often my son had allowed it. Around 6:30, I heard footsteps upstairs. Cabinet doors opened. Water running in the bathroom. Morning sounds. I stayed seated at the table holding my coffee mug while the sky turned pale gray outside. Ryan entered the kitchen first wearing sweatpants and looking tired. For a second, he seemed surprised to see me awake. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly while reaching for the orange juice. I waited for him to say something else. An apology maybe. A conversation about last night. Anything. But he just stood there staring into the refrigerator like nothing had happened. "Did you sleep okay?" he finally asked without looking at me. Such a strange question after hearing your wife reduce your mother to a burden at the dinner table. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked at him. The lines around his eyes. The gray beginning to appear near his temples. My little boy had become a man old enough to disappoint me in ways I never imagined. "I slept fine," I answered softly. He nodded, relieved by my calmness. People always relax when older women stay quiet. They mistake silence for weakness. A few minutes later, Nicole walked into the kitchen wearing silk pajamas and scrolling through her phone. She barely acknowledged me before pouring herself coffee. "The kids want pancakes," she said to Ryan. Then she glanced toward me briefly and added, "If that is okay." Not because she cared, because she wanted ownership established. Every inch of that house now operated around her permission. I looked down into my coffee cup and suddenly understood something with perfect clarity. I did not belong there anymore. Maybe I had not for a very long time. The pancakes smelled like vanilla and butter, but somehow even the kitchen felt cold that morning. Nicole moved around confidently, opening cabinets without hesitation, pulling mixing bowls from shelves I had organized 20 years earlier. She stood in the center of the room like she owned every inch of it. Maybe she did, at least emotionally. Ryan sat at the counter drinking coffee while scrolling through emails on his phone. The grandchildren laughed upstairs, their footsteps racing across the hallway floor. Life continued normally around me, and that was the part that unsettled me most. Nobody seemed aware that something enormous had broken the night before. Or maybe they were aware and simply did not care enough to address it. I rinsed my coffee cup slowly and placed it into the dishwasher. Nicole glanced at me over her shoulder. "Oh, you do not have to worry about that," she said lightly. I usually load it a certain way. I paused with my hand still resting on the dishwasher door. Such a harmless sentence on the surface, but I noticed how often those little comments had started appearing over the years. The towels folded incorrectly. The groceries bought from the wrong store. The wrong way to organize the pantry. Tiny corrections layered one on top of another until eventually you stopped feeling like a homeowner and started feeling like a guest afraid to touch anything. "Of course," I answered quietly, stepping aside. Ryan never looked up from his phone. The children came downstairs a few minutes later wearing matching flannel pajamas Nicole had bought specifically for holiday photos. Emma ran straight past me toward the pancakes without saying good morning. She used to throw herself into my arms the second she saw me. She used to beg me to read stories before bedtime whenever they visited. But children adapt quickly to emotional weather inside a family. They learn where warmth exists and where distance is encouraged. "Grandma, can I have whipped cream?" Tommy asked absent-mindedly while climbing onto a stool. Before I could answer, Nicole laughed softly. "Do not bother Grandma with all that this morning, sweetheart. She is probably tired." Again, it sounded polite enough if you were not listening carefully. But I was listening carefully now. Every word felt sharpened around the edges. I sat quietly at the far end of the table while everyone ate breakfast. The conversation moved around school schedules, ski trips, Christmas shopping, and neighborhood gossip. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody noticed I barely touched my food. At one point, Ryan mentioned a new office project that might require travel after New Year's. Nicole immediately began discussing whether the children should stay with her sister while he traveled. They spoke openly about future plans right in front of me, without once considering that I had spent years rearranging my life to help them whenever they needed childcare. School pickups, emergency babysitting, long weekends when Nicole wanted time to recharge. I had always said yes, not because I was obligated, because I loved them. Suddenly I realized something uncomfortable. The more useful I became, the less visible I was. Treated. After breakfast, Nicole gathered everyone into the living room for family pictures beside the fireplace. "Mom, come join us," Ryan called casually. But there was hesitation in his voice, almost like obligation. I stood near the staircase watching Nicole adjust everyone into place. "Maybe just immediate family for a few first," she said with a quick smile. Immediate family. Such simple words. She said them while smoothing Emma's hair and checking the lighting on her phone screen. Nobody reacted. Nobody corrected her. I stepped back quietly before anyone could notice the expression on my face. From the hallway mirror, I watched them pose together in front of George's fireplace. Ryan with his arm around Nicole, the children smiling brightly between them. Warm, complete, whole. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be erased while still standing in the room. I walked upstairs slowly and closed the bedroom door behind me. George's old flannel robe still hung beside the closet exactly where he left it. I pressed my fingers against the sleeve and suddenly felt exhausted in a way sleep could never fix. The house no longer remembered me either. That afternoon, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed for the first time since George passed away. The hinges creaked softly as I lifted the lid, releasing the faint smell of old paper, wool blankets, and the lavender sachets I used to tuck between folded quilts years ago. Inside sat 38 years of a life that no longer seemed to exist downstairs. Old Christmas cards, Ryan's elementary school drawings, yellowed receipts from road trips George and I took when we were too young to worry about cholesterol or retirement accounts. I sat cross-legged on the carpet, holding a faded photograph of George standing in front of the house the summer we bought it. He was 32 years old then, sunburned, smiling, and impossibly proud. We could barely afford the down payment at the time. I remember eating canned soup for almost 2 months because every extra dollar went toward repairs. George replaced the kitchen floor himself one winter after working 10-hour shifts at the plant all week. At night, he would come home exhausted, kneel on those cold hardwood boards, and keep hammering until midnight because he wanted Ryan to grow up in a beautiful home. "One day this place will be full of grandchildren," he used to say. He was right. He just never imagined I would become invisible inside it. I traced my fingers along the edge of the photograph and suddenly remembered another Thanksgiving nearly 20 years earlier. Ryan had been home from college, loud and happy, eating leftover pie straight from the refrigerator while George pretended to scold him. We had laughed so hard that night the dog started barking from excitement. The kitchen windows fogged from cooking. Football played in the background. At one point, George wrapped his arms around my waist while I stood at the sink and whispered, "You are the heart of this family, Evie." I believed him. Maybe that is why the silence hurts so much now. Not because Nicole disliked me. People dislike each other all the time. No, what broke me was realizing the family George and I built together no longer needed my heart inside it. Around 3 o'clock, I heard Nicole laughing downstairs while talking on the phone. Her voice carried easily through the vents. "Honestly, it feels crowded sometimes," she said casually. A pause. Then laughter again. "No, she does not really do much anymore." I stared at the bedroom door without moving. The strange thing about aging is that people slowly stop imagining you have feelings. They speak around you instead of to you. They discuss your life like you are furniture sitting quietly in the corner of the room. I looked around the bedroom then. George's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand exactly where he left them the evening before his heart attack. His old navy slippers remained tucked beside the closet. I had kept everything untouched because it comforted me. But suddenly the room felt less like a sanctuary and more like a museum preserving a version of my life nobody else respected anymore. Downstairs, I heard Ryan's voice briefly joining Nicole's conversation. Calm, relaxed, easy. The sound cut deeper than I expected. My son was not trapped. He was not being manipulated into silence. He was participating in it through absence, through cowardice, through choosing comfort over truth every single day. I closed the cedar chest carefully and stood up slowly, my knees aching from sitting on the floor too long. Then I walked toward the closet and pulled out my old suitcase from the top shelf. The wheels were dusty. George and I bought that suitcase before our trip to Maine for our 30th anniversary. I remember how excited we were just to see the ocean together for 4 days. I set the suitcase on the bed and stared at it quietly for a long time. Not dramatic, not impulsive, just stillness. The kind that comes right before a person finally accepts something painful. Outside the bedroom window, the November sky had turned pale silver. Leaves drifted across the backyard George once spent entire Saturdays raking with the grandchildren. Everything looked ordinary. But inside me, something had already begun to leave. At dinner that evening, Nicole ordered takeout instead of reheating the Thanksgiving leftovers I had spent 2 days preparing. She announced it casually while scrolling through restaurant options on her phone. "Nobody really wants turkey again," she said with a small laugh. The containers arrived 20 minutes later, filling the kitchen with the smell of garlic and soy sauce, while my homemade stuffing sat untouched in the refrigerator beside 3 full pumpkin pies. I stood at the counter quietly wrapping leftovers into foil containers nobody would probably eat. Ryan thanked the delivery driver without looking at me once. It is strange how loneliness can exist even when a room is full of people talking. The grandchildren sat at the island laughing over videos on a tablet, while Nicole discussed holiday shopping plans with Ryan. Their voices blended together into soft background noise. I felt less like family and more like an elderly neighbor who had accidentally wandered into someone else's house. At one point, Emma asked if we could decorate Christmas cookies together like we used to every December. Before I could answer, Nicole smiled tightly and said, "We are probably going to keep things simpler this year, sweetheart. Grandma gets tired easily." I looked down at the foil container in my hands. The truth was I still walked 2 miles every morning. I still balanced my own finances, maintained the garden, and cooked meals from scratch. But once people decide you are old, they begin shrinking you in their minds until eventually you become fragile even while standing perfectly upright. After dinner, Ryan disappeared into his office to answer work emails. Nicole went upstairs to put the children to bed. I stayed in the kitchen alone wiping counters that were already clean. The house settled into evening silence around me. Outside, cold rain tapped gently against the windows above the sink. I remember staring out into the backyard where George used to hang Christmas lights every November, refusing to let anyone help him because he considered it his department. One year he slipped off the ladder into a pile of leaves and laughed so hard I could barely scold him. The memory hit me unexpectedly, warm and painful all at once. I suddenly realized I could no longer remember the last time I laughed freely inside that house. Around 10 o'clock, Ryan finally walked into the kitchen rubbing his eyes tiredly. "You should get some rest, Mom," he said while grabbing a bottle of water from the refrigerator. I studied him carefully beneath the soft overhead light. There were moments when I could still see the little boy who used to crawl into bed beside me after thunderstorms. But those moments were becoming harder to find. "Ryan," I asked quietly, "are you happy?" He looked surprised by the question. "Of course," he answered too quickly. Then he shifted uncomfortably and added, "Why would you ask that?" I folded the dish towel carefully over the sink handle before answering. Because sometimes people get so used to avoiding conflict that they stop noticing what it costs them. His face tightened slightly. Not angry. Defensive. "Mom, if this is about yesterday, Nicole did not mean anything by it." I almost smiled hearing that sentence. People always say cruelty means nothing when it is directed at someone older. I heard what she said. I replied softly. "And you heard it too." Ryan sighed heavily and leaned against the counter like a tired man cornered by inconvenience instead of guilt. "She was joking," he muttered. "You know how Nicole is." Yes, I finally did know exactly how Nicole was. But more importantly, I knew how my son was. That realization hurt far more. I nodded slowly and turned off the kitchen light. "Good night, Ryan." He hesitated like he wanted to say something else, but no words came. I walked upstairs carefully, one hand resting along the banister George built himself during the second year we lived there. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingers from decades of family hands passing over it. At the top of the stairs, I paused outside the bedroom and looked back down into the darkened house. Everything inside me had gone strangely calm. Not numb. Clear. Like the moment snow begins falling and the whole world suddenly becomes quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. That night, while the rest of the house slept, I opened the suitcase and began folding my clothes inside. By 5:30 the next morning, the house was silent except for the ticking clock downstairs and the soft hum of the furnace turning on against the November cold. I zipped the suitcase carefully and stood in the middle of the bedroom looking around one last time. The pale blue curtains George picked out because he said they reminded him of the ocean in Maine. The indentation on his side of the mattress that never fully disappeared after he died. The framed photograph on the dresser from our 40th anniversary dinner where we both looked older but somehow happier than we had at 25. I expected to cry. Instead, I felt strangely steady, like someone who had spent years standing in freezing rain and finally stepped indoors. I changed into a wool coat, wrapped my scarf around my neck, and quietly carried the suitcase downstairs. Every stair creaked beneath my weight, familiar sounds I had heard for nearly 4 decades. At the bottom landing, I paused beside the living room. The Christmas boxes Nicole wanted Ryan to bring down next weekend were already stacked near the fireplace. Matching stockings set folded on top. Mine was not there anymore. I noticed that without surprise. In the kitchen, I placed my house key beside the fruit bowl and wrote a short note on the back of an old grocery receipt. I think it is time for all of us to have some space. Love, Mom. I stared at the sentence for a moment before setting the paper down carefully. No anger. No accusations. At my age, you learn that dignity speaks more clearly than shouting ever does. Outside, the air smelled like wet leaves and cold pavement. The neighborhood still slept beneath a gray morning sky. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my old sedan and slid behind the steering wheel. My hands rested there quietly for several seconds before I started the engine. Through the kitchen window, I could see the soft glow of the house lights warming rooms that no longer felt like mine. Then I backed out of the driveway without looking back again. I drove for nearly an hour with no real destination. The roads were mostly empty except for delivery trucks and people hurrying toward early shifts with paper coffee cups balanced beside them. Christmas decorations already hung in storefront windows. Artificial snowflakes, twinkling lights, red ribbons tied around street lamps. The world looked cheerful in the way it always does right before winter becomes difficult. Around 7 in the morning, I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner outside Hartford. The sign flickered slightly above the entrance. Inside, the smell of bacon and fresh coffee wrapped around me the moment I opened the door. A waitress with silver hair and tired eyes greeted me kindly and led me to a booth near the window. "Long morning," she asked while pouring coffee into a thick, white mug. I almost laughed at how simple the question was compared to the answer. "Something like that," I said softly. I ordered toast and eggs even though I was not hungry. Mostly I just needed somewhere to sit while my thoughts caught up with me. Across the diner, 2 older men argued affectionately over football scores while a young mother cut pancakes into tiny pieces for her little boy. Ordinary life moved around me without noticing my world had shifted overnight. And strangely, that comforted me. My phone buzzed around 8:15. Ryan. I stared at his name glowing on the screen while the coffee cooled in my hands. Another call followed 30 seconds later. Then a text. "Mom, where are you?" I turned the phone face down on the table without answering. For years, I had responded immediately every time they needed me. Last-minute babysitting, school pickups, holiday cooking, emotional support. But sitting there in that quiet diner booth, I realized something painful. Nobody had noticed I was disappearing until my labor disappeared with me. The waitress returned to refill my coffee and smiled gently. "You passing through town?" she asked. I looked out the window at the pale winter sky and thought about the empty years stretching behind me like a long road. Then I surprised myself with the answer. "No," I said slowly. "I think I might be starting over." The motel room smelled faintly like lemon cleaner and old carpet, but it was quiet, and for the first time in years, the silence did not feel heavy. I checked in just before noon using cash because I was not ready for questions yet. The woman behind the front desk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when she handed me the room key attached to a faded plastic tag marked 214. I carried my suitcase upstairs slowly and unlocked the door to a small room with pale yellow walls, a floral bedspread, and a window overlooking the highway. It was nothing special, but everything inside belonged to no one who resented me. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally turned my phone back over. 12 missed calls from Ryan. For text messages. 1 voicemail. Another message from Nicole asking if I was all right. I stared at the words for a long moment. Concern sounded very different when it arrived only after your absence created inconvenience. I listened to Ryan's voicemail quietly. Mom, please call me back. We are worried. His voice sounded strained, but underneath it I heard confusion more than heartbreak, as if he could not understand how the quiet woman who always stayed had suddenly left. I set the phone aside without responding. Then I took a long shower while hot water filled the small bathroom with steam. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the heat loosen something tight inside my chest. Grief changes shape as you get older. Sometimes it arrives as sadness. Other times it feels more like exhaustion finally admitting its own weight. Afterward, I dressed slowly and walked to the pharmacy across the street for toothpaste, clean socks, and a notebook. The cashier smiled politely while ringing up my things. Such ordinary kindness nearly made me emotional. Nobody there knew me as someone's burden. Nobody saw me as extra. Back in the motel room, I opened the notebook and began writing down practical things. Bank accounts, monthly expenses, property taxes, savings. George always handled investments together with me, and thankfully he insisted I understand every account before he died. Never let yourself become dependent on anybody, he told me once while organizing paperwork at the kitchen table. At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. Now his voice echoed through my mind with painful clarity. By evening, another voicemail arrived from Ryan. This one sounded different. Tighter. Mom, the kids are asking where you are. Please just answer the phone. I closed my eyes briefly. The children. Of course now my disappearance mattered. I used to pick Emma up from school every Wednesday. I attended Tommy's piano lessons when Nicole had scheduling conflicts. I baked birthday cakes, wrapped Christmas presents, stayed overnight whenever anyone was sick. Invisible work only becomes visible once it stops being done. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Clara Mitchell, my oldest friend. Ryan must have called her. I answered after the second ring. Evelyn. Her voice carried immediate concern. Honey, where are you? I looked out the motel window at headlights moving steadily along the highway. I am safe, I answered quietly. That is enough for now. Clara stayed silent for a moment. We had been friends for nearly 40 years. Long enough to understand pauses. What happened? She asked gently. I leaned back against the headboard and stared at the textured ceiling. I think I stayed somewhere too long after I stopped being welcome. My voice sounded calmer than I expected. Clara exhaled softly. Oh, Evelyn. There was no pity in her tone, only understanding. That mattered more than she probably realized. We talked for nearly an hour. About George. About aging. About how loneliness inside a crowded house hurts differently than loneliness by yourself. Before hanging up, Clara gave me the number of a realtor named Martha Green. She helped my sister find a small townhouse after her divorce, Clara explained. She is around our age. Honest. No pressure. I wrote the number carefully inside the notebook. After we hung up, I sat quietly in the dim motel room listening to traffic pass outside. Then I reached for my phone, opened Ryan's latest message, and typed 4 simple words. I need some time. Nothing more. A minute later, 3 dots appeared immediately on the screen as he began typing a response. I turned the phone off before the message arrived. The next morning, snow dusted the edges of the motel parking lot in thin white lines that melted beneath passing tires. I woke before sunrise out of habit and sat near the window wrapped in the motel blanket, watching the sky slowly brighten over the highway. For the first time in years, nobody needed breakfast from me. Nobody expected rides to school or folded laundry or grocery lists remembered without asking. The silence should have felt empty. Instead, it felt honest. Around 9 o'clock, I called Martha Green. Her voice sounded warm and practical, the kind of voice that had spent years solving problems without needing attention for it. Clara speaks very highly of you, she said after introducing herself. Why do not we meet for coffee and talk about what you are looking for? I almost answered automatically with something cautious and polite, something small. But then I realized nobody had asked what I wanted in a very long time. I think I want somewhere peaceful, I said slowly. Martha paused softly before replying. That sounds like a good place to start. We met at a small coffee shop near the town square around noon. Martha was in her early 70s with silver hair cut neatly at her shoulders and sharp blue eyes that missed very little. She wore a dark green wool coat and carried a leather folder tucked under one arm. There was something comforting about her immediately, not because she was overly friendly, because she looked at me directly when I spoke, as if my thoughts still mattered. We sat near the window while snow drifted lazily outside. Martha asked practical questions first. Budget, location, size. But eventually she leaned back slightly and said, "Now tell me what kind of home would make you feel comfortable walking through the front door every evening." The question caught me off guard. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup before answering. "Small is fine," I admitted quietly. "I just want somewhere that feels like mine." Martha nodded without pity. "A lot of women our age come to me after spending years building homes for everyone except themselves." I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. After lunch, Martha drove me to see 3 small properties. The first felt cold and narrow. The second smelled strongly of cigarette smoke beneath artificial vanilla candles. But the third one was different the moment I stepped inside. It was a modest townhouse tucked near the edge of a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes outside Hartford. 2 bedrooms, cream-colored walls, a small kitchen with sunlight pouring through the windows. The previous owner had left bird feeders hanging outside the back patio, and tiny sparrows fluttered through the snowy air while we walked through the empty rooms. "It needs some updates," Martha said carefully, "but the bones are good." I stood silently in the living room while winter light stretched softly across the hardwood floor. The place was smaller than the house George and I built together, smaller than every home I had lived in as an adult. But strangely, I could breathe there. No tension humming beneath conversations. No careful walking around someone else's moods. No feeling like an unwanted guest inside my own life. I walked into the kitchen and rested my hand against the counter. Suddenly, I could picture simple things. Coffee brewing early in the morning. Christmas music playing softly in December. A pie cooling by the window without anyone complaining the smell lingered too long. "I think this is the one," I whispered before I could second-guess myself. Martha smiled gently, but did not make a spectacle of it. She simply opened her folder and began discussing paperwork while snow continued falling quietly outside. By late afternoon, we sat together at her office, signing documents beneath fluorescent lights while holiday music played softly from a radio near the receptionist's desk. My hands trembled slightly when I wrote my name on the final page. Not from fear, from realization. At 68 years old, after decades of being wife, mother, caretaker, and invisible support beam beneath everyone else's lives, I was finally choosing something entirely for myself. When everything was finished, Martha handed me a small silver key attached to a plain blue tag. "Congratulations, Evelyn," she said warmly. "You have a new home." I stared down at the key resting in my palm. Such a tiny object, but it felt heavier than grief, heavier than loneliness. It felt like possibility. 3 weeks later, the townhouse no longer smelled empty. The walls carried the scent of cinnamon candles and fresh coffee. A knitted blanket rested over the arm of the small gray couch I bought secondhand from a retired teacher down the street. Bird feeders now hung outside the patio doors beside tiny white lights I wrapped carefully around the railing one cold afternoon while Christmas music played softly from my kitchen radio. It was not a grand life, but every inch of it felt peaceful. I had started developing small routines again. Morning walks through the neighborhood with a travel mug warming my hands. Reading beside the window after dinner while snow gathered quietly outside. Baking only when I felt like baking instead of because 12 people expected it from me. The strangest part was realizing how little space true peace actually requires. One Tuesday evening, I was arranging books on a shelf when someone knocked at the front door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Mothers always know the sound of their children waiting outside. Ryan stood on the porch, wearing a dark winter coat dusted lightly with snowflakes. He looked exhausted, older somehow. His eyes moved past me into the townhouse before returning carefully to my face. "Mom," he said softly. I stepped aside without speaking, and he walked in slowly. The house fell quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. Ryan looked around at the small living room, the framed photographs, the ceramic bowl of pine cones on the coffee table. His expression shifted slightly, confused maybe, or surprised that something so modest could still feel warm. "This is nice," he murmured awkwardly. I nodded once and walked toward the kitchen. I just made coffee. He followed me and sat carefully at the small table while I poured 2 cups. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Snow drifted softly outside the patio doors. Finally, Ryan rubbed his hands together and exhaled heavily. The kids miss you. I stirred cream into my coffee slowly before answering. I miss them too. Another silence settled between us. Not angry, just heavy with things left unsaid too long. Ryan stared down into his cup. Nicole feels terrible about what happened. I looked at him quietly over the rim of my mug. Even now, he could not say the words directly. What happened? As if cruelty becomes smaller when unnamed. Does she? I asked gently. Ryan swallowed hard. She did not mean for things to go this far. That sentence almost made me smile. People always seem shocked when quiet women finally leave. They confuse endurance with permanence. I set my cup down carefully. Ryan, do you know what hurt the most? He looked up slowly. It was not her comment. His forehead tightened slightly in confusion. Then what was it? I folded my hands together on the table and studied my son's face, seeing every age of him at once. The little boy who used to run into my arms after school. The teenager learning to drive in empty parking lots with George patiently beside him. The man now sitting across from me, unable to fully confront his own silence. It was realizing you heard it too, I said quietly. Ryan's eyes dropped immediately. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he whispered, almost to himself, I did not know what to say. I nodded slowly because I believed him. Cowardice often sounds exactly like confusion inside people who want comfort more than honesty. I know, I answered softly. Tears gathered briefly in his eyes before he looked away toward the window. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. The sentence hung between us painfully because both of us knew intentions matter far less than patterns. I stood up and walked toward the patio doors, looking out at snow covering the quiet neighborhood in white silence. Behind me, Ryan spoke again. Will you come home? I closed my eyes for one brief moment before answering. Ryan, I said gently, this is home. The room became completely still. I turned back toward him then, not angry, not triumphant, simply certain. For a long time, I lived in a place where people tolerated me because I was useful. But here, I glanced around the small kitchen glowing warmly beneath soft yellow light. Here I do not just exist. Ryan lowered his head quietly, and for the first time in years, he had no defense left to hide behind.